Hello, this is Mr. Frederickson. Today we have an activity, a game on the Red Scare of 1950 to 54. So our activity is the highest score will win the activity. Now the objective is to guess the term. We have 11 Red Scare related terms and you need to guess them. Now the quicker you guess them, the more points you'll get. However, I'm going to give you clues, and the more clues you need, the less points you have. So for instance, let's pretend this is mystery term number 1 that you have to guess. If you guess it with only the number 3 clue, oldest president ever, then you can get 3 points because that's the number next to it. But if you need a second clue, which is this is now the number 2 next to this clue, you would only get 2 points. This person's a Democrat. And if you needed that third clue, if you notice there's a 1 next to that third clue, so you're going to earn 1 point if you now guess what the term is. He used to be the vice president of the United States, and that, of course, would be President Joe Biden. So we're going to have 11 mystery terms that you're going to have to guess as quickly as possible, and you're going to keep track of your own score. So let's get ready to begin. Let's see how well you do. Let's see if you can be the best around. All right, so term number 1. This was part of a campaign to expose suspected communists. Now, if you know what the answer is, you should write it down. If you get it correct, you have 6 points. But now, during this campaign, people in power accused innocent people of crimes with little evidence to back up the accusations. So what was this campaign called? For 4 points, thousands of reputations were destroyed during this time. 3 points, left of center Americans were targeted, amongst others. For 2 points, this peaked from 1950 to 1954, although there were some remnants of it after and before. And for 1 point only, similar events had happened before in America from 1919 to 1920. What was these events or this campaign referred to? And the answer is the Red Scare. Now, there were 2 Red Scares in 1919, 1920. A previous one had happened. This is A. Mitchell Palmer, if you remember the Palmer raids. But from 1950 to 1954, a much elevated level of fear and excitement would be happening. In such an intense fear about communism being all around us, and that it was spreading, and that there were people everywhere, and we didn't know who they were. Americans were communists, and they'd taken over our government and much of society. So who was spreading this fear? Well, politicians were, business leaders, and the media. So innocent people were getting accused, and their lives were getting investigated, and those accusations led to destruction. Now, many of them were placed on trial, and again, who was targeted? Left of center Americans, because when it comes to ideology, those on the left were more similar to supporting communism, which of course was the ideology of our enemy, the Soviet Union. Often people that were just a little bit different, that stood out for whatever reason, often would be targeted. And anybody who fought back during the Red Scare would immediately be targeted. That was a tactic of Red Scare leaders. So the results were reputations were destroyed of people that were accused. Those people lost their jobs, often were put in prison. Their lives were somewhat destroyed. And again, not America's finest hour, this Red Scare period. So let's look into number 2. Here's your chance to get another point. Term number 2. For 5 points, if you can guess it on this clue, North Korea attacking South Korea led to the fear that made the U.S. more susceptible to this. 4 points. China falling to communism created the fear that led to the U.S. being more susceptible to this. For 3 points. The Soviet Union getting the atomic bomb years earlier than we thought they could made the U.S. more susceptible to this. 2 points. If you can guess the answer at this point, the crisis of the Berlin blockade contributed to the fear that made the U.S. more susceptible to this. And finally, 1 point you will earn. The catching of the Soviet spies in the U.S. led to the fear that made the U.S. more susceptible to this. And the answer is the Red Scare. Yet again, mystery term twice. So once again, people were scared and that the enemy was everywhere, and we didn't know who. They could be anyone. And why was there so much fear? Lots of reasons. The Berlin blockade showed the Soviet aggression. We caught spies like Elgar Hiss. Soviets had got the atomic bomb by having spies, and communist China had turned to become communist, which made people fearful. North Korea attacked South Korea, which showed the aggression of the communists everywhere. Demagogues in the United States were spreading fear that our enemies were all around us. Yellow journalism, the media just kept talking and exaggerating these fears to sell newspapers and other forms of media. So yes, absolutely, the Red Scare was amongst us for those causes. All right, term number 3 that you have to guess. If you can guess the term after this clue, you get 5 points. This resulted in a rise of nativism and racism, elevated levels. 4 points if you can guess it now. Americans became intolerant of any behavior that wasn't deemed normal during this. 3 points. Political dissension, meaning disagreeing with other people based on politics, stopped out of fear, which meant democracy was weakened because people weren't willing to speak and advocate their minds. 2 points if you can get the clue now or what the magic mystery term is. In the name of security, freedom, and privacy of U.S. citizens was compromised during this. And 1 point if you can guess, Americans couldn't act as themselves out of fear and instead embraced conformity. The answer was Red Scare again, 3 times in a row. I mean, that's really easy, I suppose. So again, conformity, everybody felt the pressure to act just like everybody else during the Red Scare. You weren't allowed to think differently because that would create suspicion of you. Vicious accusations, your life would be destroyed. Again, Red Scare, not America's finest hour. All right, term number 4, try to guess it. Might even be different this time. So try to guess term number 4 for 5 points. During the Red Scare, many leaders came to power using this method. For 4 points, Republicans used this method more than others, more than Democrats. 3, this tactic could be used fairly, but most often during the Red Scare, it was used unfairly. 2 points, this tactic resulted in many elections being primarily a competition by which candidates tried to win votes by convincing voters they were as anti-communist as possible. And finally, for 1 point, this is the tactic of accusing political opponents of being connected with communism in order to gain a political advantage over them, or even accuse them of being communists, I guess. The answer is red baiting. Now, you have an election soon? Now, the clear path of victory, because you could choose any way to try to get elected, is to accuse your opponent of being soft on communism, or at least being a sympathetic person to communism. They might even be a communist. Now, that is the way to crush your opponent because nobody's going to support them if they think they might be a communist. Examples, here is a red baiting poster making President Obama at the time, look like Lenin. Here's an example of Bernie Sanders looking like Lenin. This is a famous poster of Lenin. Here's another poster that politically was trying to make this person look exactly like a communist. And again, don't elect them. They're probably a communist. Now, did this all work? And the answer is yes. In 1952, Democrats were knocked out of office. Republicans were successful in almost every single way. The Republicans took over the House, the Senate, and even the presidency. And much of it was on the concept of riding the Red Scare and red baiting. So Richard Nixon himself was a huge red baiter multiple times, and he was rewarded with the vice presidency after only a short period in Congress, or should I say the Senate. So after hundreds of campaigns of red baiting and people yelling at the American people that they should be scared, the American people indeed were scared, hence the Red Scare. Term number 5 for you to guess. For 5 points, if you can guess it, Executive Order 9835 created this type of program for the federal government. For 4 points, both President Truman and President Eisenhower used this, although more famously under Truman, when over 1,000 federal employees were fired and 6,000 resigned because of this program. 2 points. This type of program stated that if you were in any far left-leaning organization, that was grounds for potential dismissal from your job. Just being part of an organization that was very lefty or sympathetic to communist thoughts. And 1 point, this type of program created mass fear because people thought they would be fired based upon who their friends were or what books they read or what jobs they had held. All right, what is term number 5? The answer is loyalty programs or loyalty. Harry Truman was president from 45 to 53, but he was under a lot of political pressure from the Republicans saying that he was too weak on communism in the Soviet Union. And this is going to lead to the peak of the Red Scare because the communists were proven to be here in our government, and Truman had to do something about it. So to fix the problem, he issued Executive Order 9835, which created loyalty panels, which closely examined all members of the government. So the loyalty program looked closely at government and specifically at all workers that worked within the government. Now, what group, specifically all of these workers, what groups were you a part of? So if you were part of an organization that was left-leaning, you were gone. Who were your friends? If your friends were found out to be sympathetic to communist ways, even if it wasn't you, you were gone. What books had you checked out from the library? Were they sympathetic to the Soviet Union? That could lead to you losing your job. Maybe it was something you once said in a newspaper or an article or in a book you wrote. I mean, again, thousands of people either resigned out of protest, resigned because they thought they were going to be fired, or were literally fired. One of the worst destructions of the violation of privacy of people's First and Fourth Amendments, rights of privacy. So examples of those who were impacted, people that were deemed sexual perversion, guilty of that, meaning people that were gay, and alcoholics, and people that were in sketchy relationships, cheating on their spouses, people that were in bad financial trouble. Now, the reason why they were fired from their jobs was because they were deemed open to blackmail by the Soviet Union. Specifically, part of the Red Scare was the Lavender Scare, which was basically the firing of anybody who was gay. And the reason was because they were susceptible to blackmail. The idea that typically in the 1940s and 50s, due to heavy prejudice against gay Americans, if you were gay, you were often hiding it. So if the federal government, through their loyalty programs, discovered that you were hiding that you were gay, you were deemed susceptible to blackmail by the Soviet Union. That the Soviet Union would try to, threaten you that they would bring you out of the closet and therefore hold you accountable and blackmail you so you would sell U.S. secrets. So therefore, you were dismissed from your job. And President Truman fired lots of people directly because they were found out to be gay, 425 to be precise. President Eisenhower issued Executive Order 10450, which literally said, we will not have gay people in our government or military anymore. An estimated over 5,000 were relieved from their positions. And that was in existence, that order, until 1973, where finally the U.S. government backed off and said, we will take each of these situations on a case-by-case basis, basically saying we might allow gay people to work. Now, that's going to exist until 1995, until Bill Clinton passed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, saying, all right, well, gay people still can't be in our military, but as long as they keep it quiet, we'll let them. In 2017, this was completely repealed, and there was no more, at least, acute and obvious prejudice against gay Americans. They now publicly were allowed to work both in the government and the military. So thousands of lives destroyed because of these loyalty programs, and very, very sad. Actually, this was much, much worse than people thought because American businesses copied the government and instituted their own loyalty programs, firing even more tens of thousands of people based on sketchy or abnormal behavior. So colleges did the same. Loyalty programs destroyed tens of thousands of lives. Such sad. We're now back to our game, and specifically mystery term number 6. Term number 6 was created in 1938 for 6 points. For 5 points, originally created to find Americans with fascist-leaning tendencies during the war. 4 points, its objective was to stop un-American propaganda. For 3 points, if you can guess it, accusations from this group would destroy reputations and careers. 2 points, its most famous target were the Hollywood 10. Its members were in the House of Representatives, and for 1 point, if you can guess it, its primary goal during the Red Scare was to find and stop the spreading of information from communists. The term itself was HUAC, or also known as House of Un-American Activities Committee. Now, in the House of Representatives in 1938, they were worried about German propaganda being spread, and HUAC said, we're going to find people spreading that propaganda and put an end to it. So that was what HUAC was supposed to do. But in 1945, the Germans were defeated, and HUAC said, well, we got to do something. What now? So they said, what's more un-American than Germans is communists. So we're going to look for communists. So they started issuing subpoenas to people to have them come before them to testify. And they started accusing anybody who acted slightly abnormal. And their common phrase that they made famous was, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And people were fully exposed, covered by cameras. So even just the question itself made them look guilty, even with no evidence. Their reputations were ruined. They lost friendships, lost their jobs, lost their homes, because without jobs, you can't pay your mortgage, and their families often could not even eat anymore. It was a tragic situation. They were told, rat on your friends or else. It created a witch hunt where people had to rat on other people so that they would not be locked up themselves. So the Fifth Amendment totally destroyed, because once again, the Fifth Amendment says you have the right not to incriminate yourself. So what happened was HUAC would issue immunity. So now whatever you said actually couldn't incriminate you. So now the Fifth Amendment became irrelevant by legal standards. And if you didn't rat on your friends, didn't answer their questions, you could be held in contempt, which often led to a year behind bars. Thousands of lives were destroyed by HUAC and so on. So term number 7 related to the Red Scare that you have to guess. If you can guess now, you get 7 points. Worked within an industry that had a reputation for loose morals, foreign-born leaders, Jewish leaders, and left-leaning workers. 6 points. This group refused to talk to HUAC. 5 points. This group said the First Amendment gave them the right not to answer questions about their friends and past memberships in left-leaning political organizations. 4 points. They were the most famous victims of HUAC. 3 points. This group was 8 screenwriters and 2 directors. For 2 points, if you can guess the mystery term, this group was found in contempt of Congress and placed in prison in 1950 for 1 year. And finally, for 1 point, after 1915, this group was no longer allowed to or able to put up American propaganda because they were barred and also in prison, I suppose. The answer of this mystery term, the Hollywood 10. Clearly, I didn't have a slide saying that. In 1947, HUAC was targeting Hollywood because they thought that Hollywood was very powerful with all of their ability to make movies and influence millions of people. And also, Hollywood had a reputation for having a very left-leaning people that thought kind of a liberal way, I should say. So, the Hollywood Reporter, a famous magazine at the time that covered Hollywood, issued a list of suspected people that seemed left-leaning and were putting out films that seemed to kind of advocate Soviet causes, even kind of unconsciously. So immediately, HUAC is like, well, that's not good. So they start calling those people on that list in front of them and start asking them about their true thoughts and what groups they were a part of and who their friends were that were communists. So HUAC did that. They subpoenaed all the people on the list, and the most famous people they subpoenaed were 8 writers and 2 directors. They were most famous because they refused to talk and answer questions. They became known as the Hollywood 10. And HUAC said, rat on your friends or else. We gave you immunity. Fifth Amendment don't work here. And so this is an example of really the First Amendment being totally violated, because we have the right to remain to say what we want or not to say in most cases. And they said this is awful. So again, we talked about that. They wouldn't answer even with immunity, and they were held in contempt of Congress. Again, a lot of people consider this one of the worst violations of the First Amendment ever. So they were off to prison for a while, and as a result, most everybody else was so scared because they didn't want to spend a year in prison, and most of Hollywood started ratting on everybody and talking. Over 300 jobs were lost, reputations were ruined, friendships gone. Once you lost your job, of course, you couldn't pay your mortgage, your family couldn't eat. And again, the Hollywood 10 going to prison resulted in Hollywood really taking a beating, a violation of freedom. So term 8, remember we only have 11. See if you can guess term 8. For 5 points, Americans found themselves on these if there was any rumor about a connection they had with communism. 4 points. Because of these, thousands of Americans lost their jobs and couldn't get new ones. For 3 points. Because of these, thousands of Americans couldn't get new jobs. 2 points. These are illegal today. And 1 point. These are lists that companies would pass around to others within their industries to prevent certain people from being hired during the 1950s because workers were accused of being communists, so they got put on these lists. And the answer is blacklists. That was the term you were trying to guess. Now, let's say your boss thinks you are a communist, you work at McDonald's, you get fired. A few calls, and now everybody has heard you're a communist and nobody will hire you. You have been blacklisted. The most famous example after the Hollywood 10 was on June 22nd, 1950. 151 actors, screenwriters, directors, and musicians all found themselves on a list produced by some private Americans. The list was called the Red Channel List, and immediately they were found banned. Nobody would hire them because they were evil, according to this list. Now, even if you weren't on this list, if you were found to be a friend of people on that list, you were called a sympathizer, and you too also wouldn't work. Often over 500 people were said to be completely boycotted by these blacklists. Just even if you had moderate thinking, then you were often on that list. And that's all going to go on until 1960, when suddenly that blacklist was ripped up and people realized that it was truly a horrible thing, accusing people of crimes just by the way they thought. Term number 9. 7 points if you can guess it right now. Extremely well-respected and powerful member of the State Department. He was at the Yalta Conference as well. His first name starts with an A. For 6 points if you can guess it. He was hated by some by having refined tastes, academic demeanor, and a Harvard degree. He kind of came across as he was better than people. For 5 points, he was accused by Whittaker Chambers of being a spy. 4 points, the idea that he was a spy meant anybody could be a spy, so that scared Americans. For 3 points, his trial, perhaps the most famous spy trial of the Cold War. 2 points, Whittaker Chambers produced the Pumpkin Papers to prove that this person had passed spy papers to him. And for 1 point, if you can guess it now, it was proven that the Pumpkin Papers were written on this person's typewriter, and he was guilty and he was thrown in prison. His name was Alger Hiss. Now, Whittaker Chambers was a spy for the Soviet Union from 1932 to 37. And in 1937, he received orders from Moscow to go to Moscow, and he's got frightened. He had heard that Stalin had killed plenty of Russians, and he didn't want to go there and possibly get killed himself. So he also turned against the Soviet Union, which he was a spy for, when the Soviet Union linked up with Hitler with the Non-Aggression Pact right before World War II. So he changed his mind. He actually confessed that he was a spy. And in 1948, Whittaker Chambers was called before HUAC as a former communist, and he turned 18 spies that he had previously worked with in. Now, the most famous of the 18 that he ratted on was Alger Hiss. And what made him so famous was Alger Hiss was one of the most powerful people in the State Department in the U.S. government. So there's no way he could be guilty because people loved him. So Alger Hiss responded in front of HUAC. I have never seen this man before. And of course, at this point, one of them had to be lying. So Whittaker Chambers says, I got proof, and I'll show it to you. He led authorities out to Westminster, Maryland, out into the middle of a farm patch. And he said, inside this pumpkin is evidence. And it turns out the pumpkin had been hollowed out in the middle of a field. And inside was microfiche, which held photocopies, or should I say pictures, of all the documents that Alger Hiss had given him. So he turns this over. That's young Richard Nixon there looking at it. Richard Nixon went all out to prove that Alger Hiss was guilty. And it turns out that one of the keys on the typewriter that Alger Hiss had been typing up to copy documents was slightly ajar or slightly off. And that document, and that meant they eventually hunted down the typewriter, which Alger Hiss actually had sold at that point. And when they found it, it turns out that Alger Hiss's keyboard actually had a crooked key, which proved that these documents were passed on by him, given to Whittaker Chambers. Now, at this point, the statute of limitations was up, so Alger Hiss couldn't be convicted of espionage or being a spy, but they could get him for lying. So he went to jail or prison for 5 years and, of course, lost his job for perjury. 5 years later, so that's Alger Hiss being booked. And again, great fear spread because if Alger Hiss could be guilty, a beloved American government worker, a friend of FDR, anybody could. And this is going to spread fear. Almost done. Term number 9. For 7 points, these were spies. And 6, these were the only spies ever executed during the Cold War. They stole thousands of documents that led the Soviet Union to develop the atomic bomb earlier than we thought they could. They had small children, which created sympathy for them. 3 points. The reason they got the death penalty was to motivate them to rat on other spies, and they never did, so they were executed. And 2 points, they stole secrets from the Manhattan Project. one point, they were married and their last name started with Rosen. And the answer is the Rosenbergs. So during 1939, World War II, Albert Einstein, not yet famous, wrote a letter to FDR saying that, hey, the Germans are trying to get a nuclear weapon. So FDR started the Manhattan Project to develop a nuclear weapon before the Germans did. And Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, or should I say Julius, worked on the Manhattan Project, and he smuggled documents out to his wife, who would type them up and hand them to their handler or their Soviet liaison connection, so that he got caught and she got caught, and with all that evidence. And basically, Julius was told, hey, rat on your friends or your wife's going to be executed too. He didn't, and they both were executed. Now, at their execution, when they were sentenced, this was what the judge said: I consider your crime worse than murder. I believe your conduct in putting in the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb had already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in North Korea. It gave North Korea confidence to invade South Korea. And the resultant casualties of 50,000 Americans dying. And who knows how many millions more of innocent people will pay the price for your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of this country. No one can say that we do not live in a constant state of tension. We have evidence of your treachery all around us every day, for civilian defense activities throughout the nation are aimed at preparing us for an atomic bomb attack. That judge was mad, basically saying now that the communists had the atomic bomb because of the spying, they were confident enough to invade South Korea. So he sentenced them to death, and by death, they would meet by the electric chair, both of them. And for many years, many Americans felt that they were actually innocent. But the problem was, but once the Cold War ended in the 1990s, the Soviet Union admitted that they were indeed guilty, that they worked for them. So the legacy of this is people were so scared that it's going to empower people like Joseph McCarthy to basically lead the Red Scare. Term number 10, almost done, just 2 left. 7 points if you can guess the mystery term. He was the #1 leader and cause of the Red Scare. For 6 points, he convinced America that spies were everywhere and they were just going to destroy the country. For 5 points, he became a senator in 1946. 4 points, became famous after a 1950 speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. It's famously known as the Wheeling speech, West Virginia speech. For 3 points, famously stated that there were 205 members of the Communist Party in our State Department. 2 points, famous for gaining power by accusing people without evidence of being communists. And 1, he destroyed thousands of lives. And the answer is Joseph McCarthy. So he was the face of the Red Scare, perhaps the greatest offender, although there were many. He was a senator from Wisconsin. He was elected to the Senate in 1946. He was just average. So he needed an issue to make the people fearful. So they would need to vote for him so he could solve the problem. So in that West Virginia Wheeling speech, he held up a piece of paper saying he had the names of 205 communists that were in the State Department ready to destroy the country. This shocked the whole country. The whole country immediately said, wow, we're all going to die. We need this man to save us. So he found that the tension eventually waned, so he needed to keep accusing people and keep saying that he himself had the names of secret communists in the government. Kept making accusations. If anybody accused him, he would accuse them and destroy them with his power. So that he did catch some communists and certainly made some communists run away. But he destroyed so much privacy, never actually had any names of communists generally, and never had evidence against them. So this kind of tactic of accusing people of crimes without any evidence just to gain power, he's kind of a demagogue, but it's called McCarthyism, accusing somebody of being a communist of really anything and hiding that you don't have evidence, using this to gain power and influence, pressuring them to rat on other people so you can keep accusing people, and just keep that accusation going. If somebody challenges you, accuse them to get them to back down, to discredit them, and use all of this fear you've generated to keep your power going. That's called McCarthyism. And finally, we reach the end of our game, our activity, the last term. Guess term number 11. For 6 points, he was the leader of the Red Scare by some estimates. 5 points, he lost powers after 4 years when he attacked the army. For 4 points, the Army said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" This was the quotes that really woke America up that he had no decency and he should lose power. 3 points. People always heard his accusations, but never really followed up or listened long enough to know he didn't have evidence. 2, in 1954, the Senate finally censured him or punished him or quieted him, publicly acknowledging that he was a bad person for what he was doing. And for 1 point, he did die quickly after leaving the Senate of complications most likely related to excessive drinking and depression. And his name was Joseph McCarthy. So his downfall was television. He normally made accusations without evidence, and nobody could call him on it because nobody saw it. But finally, he actually accused the Army on television. People saw how useless and terrible his tactics were. So McCarthy was put down. So moving forward at this time, add up the total number of points that you have, and we will declare ourselves a winner. Congratulations. Hopefully you won. And certainly, hopefully this review helped you understand the major concepts of the Red Scare. And of course, look for your follow-up assignment on Google Classroom. And have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone.